All right, so here in the components folder, first I want to add a new folder, call it common. This is where we'll add all the reusable components that are not specific to the domain of the Vidly application, such as like components, pagination, tables, forms, and so on. So in the common folder, let's add a new file, like.jsx, imrc, and cc, we're going to call it like. Now, what is the interface of this component? As the input, we should tell this component whether the given entity, like a movie, is liked or not. So here we need an input property called liked, which is basically a Boolean, it can be a true or false. What is the output of this component? What are the events that this component is going to raise? Whenever we click this heart icon, we want this component to raise an onClick event. So whoever is using this component will then be notified, and then they will take care of toggling the like property of a given object and saving the changes in the database. So this component itself knows absolutely nothing about movies. It's just a simple dumb component that is responsible for rendering an empty or a full heart. It's up to the consumer of this component to tell it what kind of heart we want it to render. So let's go ahead and implement this. For now, we don't need the state, so I'm going to delete this. Now back in the Font Awesome documentation, I'm going to copy this markup here and simply paste it in front of our return keyword. First, I want to make sure that the basic plumbing is going to work. I don't care about clicks and full or empty hearts. I just want to make sure that we get a heart icon in front of each movie. So we have a very basic like component. Now let's go to our movies component. I'm going to add a new column here. So in the table heading, this is our delete column. I'm going to duplicate this. And then in the table body, just before the delete button, I'm going to add another TD. And this is where we're going to render our like component. We need to import this on the top. So import like from common/like. Let's test the application up to this point. So we have an empty heart in front of each movie. Beautiful. This is how I want you to write code, step by step. Don't make big moves. Just write a little bit of code, test it, make sure it works, and then go ahead to the next step. Now we want to work on the input of this component. So depending on the input, this component should render a full or an empty heart. So back in our movies component, here is our like component. Let's pass an input property, liked. For now, I just want to set it temporarily to true. I want to hard code this value. Now back in our light component, the difference between an empty and a full heart is only this postfix here. So we can change this code like this. Let's declare a variable, classes. We set it to FA and FA-heart. This is the base. Now, we look at our props. If this.props.liked is false, we're going to append this postfix-o to these classes. So classes plus equal -o. Now we render the classes dynamically. So we set this to classes. And by the way, I just copied this code from Font Awesome documentation. Here we need to rename this attribute to class name. Save the changes. So now the input to this component works. Beautiful. Let's make this dynamic. So back in our movies component, instead of hard coding true here, I want to set this to movie.liked. So in a real world application, when we get the list of movies from the server, each movie object should also have a property called liked, and that determines if the current user has liked that movie or not. If the user is not authenticated, that property would be false or null or undefined, whatever. It's not going to be true. Now, to make sure that this works, I'm going to go to our fake movie service. So this is where we're getting the list of movies from our imaginary server. Here in the first movie object, I'm going to add the liked property and set it to true. With this change, when we go back to the browser, our first movie should be liked. Now, back here, you can see this is liked, the others are not. Beautiful. Now, the next thing we want to work on is the click event of this like component. I just want to click it and make sure we get a message in the console. We don't care about changing the state. So back in our movies component, here's our like component. This component should raise an onClick event that we need to handle. So onClick, we're going to set this to this.handle like. Let's go ahead and create this method. So up here, we should put all our event handlers in one place. Handle like. For now, I just set it to a very simple function without any parameters. In the future, we'll decide what parameter we need to pass here. Let's just do a basic console.log like clicked, just to make sure all the plumbing is working. Now, back to our like component, we should handle the onClick event of this DOM element and raise a custom event, which also happens to be called onClick. But these two events are different. So when I add onClick here, we're responding to the click event of DOM elements. But when I set this to this.props.onClick, we are raising another custom event called onClick. We could call this on like toggle. Doesn't matter. In this case, the DOM event as well as our custom event happen to have the same name. So now our like component is raising an onClick event. Let's test this. Back in the browser, let's open up the console and click this icon. Beautiful, we got this message here. Now you can see our mouse pointer doesn't look like a hand. We can fix this by applying a class or a simple inline style. In this case, because we're dealing with only a single CSS attribute, I would prefer to use an inline style, but if you prefer a class, that's perfectly fine. So we set the style attribute to an expression. We pass a style object. Here we'll have cursor set to a string pointer. Like this. Now, back in the browser, you can see we have this beautiful hand icon. So now that our plumbing is working, we're successfully raising an event from this component and handling it in our movies component. We need to work on changing the state. So back in our movies component, here in handle like, we need to know what movie is being liked or disliked. So this event handler should receive a movie parameter. Now let's go back to where we have used this to make sure we pass this movie argument. Scroll down. Here's our like component. onClick. Here we need to pass an arrow function. We're going to call this.handle like, and as an argument, we're going to pass this movie object that we are rendering. So we pass the movie object here. Once again, I'm going to go back to this method and log this movie object on the console before changing any state. I want to make sure we're getting the right movie in that event handler. So here's our event handler. Let's pass this movie right here. Save the changes, back in the console. The first movie is Terminator, so when I click this, we get Terminator, beautiful. The second movie is Die Hard. Let's test that too. We get Die Hard, perfect. Now we are ready to change the state. So here, just like before, we don't want to change the state directly. We want to take a copy and give the new state to the setState method of our component. So first, I'm going to declare a constant movies and clone this.state.movies. Now here we have an array of objects, so we don't want to modify one of those objects directly. We want to clone that object. So in this array, first we need to find the index of that object. That's it. Store it in this constant. Now we go to movies of index and set this to a new object. And here we simply use the spread operator to clone this object. So we copy all the properties here. Now we're going to change movies of index dot liked. We simply toggle it. So we set it to the not operator of movies of index.liked. So if it's true, it becomes false, otherwise it becomes true. And finally, we call this .setState and pass the new movies array. Let's test the application. So let's dislike Terminator. It's gone. Let's like it again. It's back. Beautiful. Application is working. Now later in the future, when we talk about calling HTTP services, this is where we're going to call the server to persist the changes. So all the code we have written here is purely for updating the UI, for updating the view. But we should also call our backend to make sure that the changes are persisted in a database. Now, one last thing before we finish this lecture. Back in our like component, you can see this component is a controlled component because it receives all the data it needs via props, and it notifies any changes to the data, again, by using props. So it doesn't have any state itself. And here we don't have any helper methods, any event handlers. We only have a render method. So we can turn this component into a stateless functional component and simplify this code. So let's delete these comments. SFC, short for stateless functional component, tab. We're going to call it like. And then we don't need this export because we already have one right here. So let's delete this. And finally, I'm going to move the content of the render method into this new function. So I'm going to hold down Alt and press the up arrow to move this code. And then we delete this return keyword. So now we have a stateless functional component. It's a little bit simpler than a class that extends the component. So let's delete this and we're done. Just remember, when you convert a class to a functional component, you should get rid of all the references to this. So I'm going to select both these references, delete them, and then pass props as a parameter to this function.